Thank you very much. I really appreciate sort of being invited. I feel like a bit of an outsider, but I've got a lot of friends in your industry and even a lot of familiar faces here. So I've done a lot of work in your industry. I've had the opportunity to make some observations, and to Jen's point earlier about the boom-bust cycle that you all have to endure, it's like really, it's about as bad as you can be in terms of volatility, industry volatility, headcount volatility. And so that creates some interesting problems. And interesting is a nice euphemism. But there's one in particular that I've observed that has been repeated. And again, to Jen's point about doing things that can mitigate the volatility of this boom-bust cycle that is your industry, I think this is one small area. It's certainly not on the demand side, it's on the operations side, it's on the boring side, right? It's real estate, it's office space. It's not the sexy stuff that I got to watch with vectors and everything else. It's like, holy cow, it's in college again. My math is much simpler than that. But at any rate, here's the problem, and I'll get right into this. You all are, especially if you're in the serial development business or if you are a startup, you've got some work, and you're ready to go to work, you staff up, and maybe you've got 3 years of commitment in terms of project work in your pipeline, and you're saying to yourself, well, we got 3 years of work, we've got essentially 3 more years to get our next deal landed, so what are we going to do with our operations? A natural way to look at this would be to say, well, let's do a 3-year lease. We can't predict what's going to happen after 3 years, so let's not get too far over our skis here, and let's make a commitment that we can manage. And here's where the seduction comes in. And just a show of hands, who's been through the office lease process? Okay, so a couple studio heads. Many of you will be in this position someday where you are making the decision for your studio on what space to rent. And it seems like a trivial thing. And usually your mind races to, well, I want the cool office. I want it to be near my house, and I want it built out awesome, and I want to be able to take a razor around on the ground, and I want paintball wars in the back part of the building, and I want, your mind starts to go towards what could be cool about the space instead of what's practical about the space, and what business purpose does it serve, as boring as that sounds to an audience of gamers. But in our business, you can renovate space, right? You don't have to go in and spend your own money on somebody else's building. The landlord will do that for you, but it's related. The amount of money that they're willing to give you is a direct function of the amount of term that you're willing to commit to if you want the same type of rental rate, because essentially the landlord's making you a loan in those improvements, and you're paying back that loan. It's amortizing over time as you're paying your rent. A component of your rent is paying back that money. Don't be mistaken about it. And so this is where many of your peers have been seduced in the past, and I think it has to do with the way that you all approach your own business, which is why it's such a cool business. It's not just getting it done and delivering product, it's about making it cool. And when you talk to gamers about their motivation for being in the business or their motivation for doing a particular game, it may not always be economic. And so here you're faced with a 3-year lease that will give you an $18 tenant improvement allowance. That's some industry jargon, but $18 per square foot is what the landlord will give you. What does that mean? That's about enough money to do some, change the carpet, repaint, reconfigure a few offices, but not a whole lot more than that. You're not going to turn a warehouse into a studio with that kind of money, okay? So the creative mind starts to race, and you say, wow, $18 in that space, that'll make the space functional. We can exist there. We have the right amount of workspaces, the right amount of power. We have our after-hours HVAC solved and all these details. But then you start to say, well, how are we going to get our next deal? We want to look like a legitimate firm. We want to really kind of show off who we are. And so we don't want just a suitable office space. We want something that will sort of do some of our marketing labor for us to the publishers. And so you say to yourself, well, if I did a 5-year deal, now we're talking, I got some money here, and I can turn this into something that, you know, like Midway Games did with MTV coming to take some video of it because it was so nice. And so you say, well, and beyond that, you also get more leverage as a 5-year tenant versus a 3-year tenant. You're more attractive to landlords, and so they're more willing to give you concessions, and so you're likely to get a better deal overall. So there's another source of seduction that you say, wow, we're going to get a better deal. We get a nicer space. Surely in the next 3 years we can get enough work, and this space is actually going to be a tool to help us, you know, recruit top talent and to show off to our clients, our publishers. Well, the challenge is, well, let's take some real examples. So these are two, actually Ian's firm there at the Avalon, Total Immersion, and their downstairs neighbor is Tryon. And this is fairly typical of the type of office space that you and your community seem to select. You go for the Class A stuff. You like it well located, near where everybody lives. It's a lifestyle business, and so that's cool. I mean, that you have to play that game to attract talent. But as you'll see through this presentation, I think it's a seduction. So if you did, let's say you wanted to go into a building like this, and you wanted to do a nice deal. You wanted to do a totally over the top. And Total Immersion's build-out is not over the top. They just completely reconfigured the space. And furthermore, they're not a startup anymore. Their revenue has stabilized, frankly, and so they can afford to make a longer-term commitment. But I'm going to get into why, or how even with that kind of level of confidence, how you still have to be a little bit paranoid about the future, and how Total Immersion has done just that in creating flexibility. So if you took a deal like this, in this more industry jargon, $22 a square foot might be your starting rental rate. That means per square foot per year. If you're in 10,000 feet, that's $220,000 a year. So that covers everything: electricity, janitorial, all your operating expenses, everything. So you look at the first 3 years, which is, again, the period of time that you have some certainty about your head count, or at least some degree of comfort about your head count. If you turn that into an annuity, again, I don't know if there's any finance people in here, but you basically normalize those first 3 numbers using a 10% interest rate, and you get $23.33. That's effectively what you're going to feel like you're paying during those first 3 years of that lease. Now, what if you needed to vacate after the 3rd year? And this could be, as you saw on that first slide, both because you've outgrown the space or because work has evaporated and you are downsizing. And so either one of these are common in your business. And as you all know, I'm not telling you anything. So what happens here? If you have to vacate after the 3rd year, well, what are your choices? Your first choice is to sublease out of that deal. And so you find a subtenant. Now, the problem with finding a subtenant is they won't pay what you paid. You don't have the ability to give them options and rights like the landlord does. They are a powerless subtenant. So if they want to renew, they got to scrap it out. They don't have any rights to do that. If they want to expand, they got to scrap it out. Furthermore, they have very little term, and you probably, because you are off doing other things and not in the real estate business, are not really going to put up additional cash so they can renovate the building like a landlord would. So all this means you're going to end up not maybe recovering half of what you are paying in those last years, and those first 3 years are going to end up feeling like $30 a square foot. So it's a very expensive proposition, even with subleasing. If you were a little bit more proactive, you get a termination right, and we'll talk about why these things are so valuable. Total Immersion's got one, and usually you have to sort of make the landlord whole with these termination options. So you got to pay him back the balance of that loan that he made when he built out the space, he or she. So this is a little bit lower than 30. You get to 28, but it's still pretty expensive compared to your 23. Okay, and the best way to use this termination option, and this is why every one of you, every time you make a decision, when you're in a decision-making role about real estate, should have a termination option in your lease. If you do more than 3 years, have a termination option, period. Why? Because they're used more often as leverage than they are to actually end a lease. This is the strategy that we're currently employing for Total Immersion, who wants to grow. They've got a neighbor next to them. They're really in this space, and they're a captive audience. The landlord could really hammer them with a high rental rate on that expansion, except that we have the right to terminate, right? So it gives you that hammer that you need to have the leverage. So you can expand or contract or whatever you need, make a new deal with your landlord. The best deal of all in terms of risk mitigation is what Tryon did, who was their neighbor. And it was an easier proposition for Tryon because they had a 3-year development cycle for Rift, right? So they knew, well, we don't want to do any commitments past 3 years because we don't know what's going to happen. So they just did a 3-year lease. And what did that mean? They still were able to recruit good talent. They didn't get as much money as Total Immersion did in their 5-year lease, but it's a nice enough space and a good location, right? So some pithy parting advice from an outsider who's not in the trenches with you guys but is observing you. Strive for as-is space. As-is space makes the deal cheaper for the landlord, makes the deal cheaper for you, less risky for everybody. It's just a better deal. Stay short-term and nimble. So be ready to move often because really real estate is just a commodity. It's not a recruiting tool. And that brings me to the final points, which is I think a foxhole mentality among your employees is a better bonding catalyst or whatever to your employees than having an awesome office space. Everybody fights over those window offices, feels entitled because they got an awesome office, as opposed to getting in the trenches together and believing in the idea, believing in your management, absorbing the culture naturally because you're onto something cool. Don't let your real estate dictate your culture, or don't use it as a culture building tool because it's not a good one. It's not as effective as you are at building the culture. And if you fall into this trap, you will perpetuate the cycle of bust, which is putting basically a friction on your whole industry, which we love. Austin is in love with this industry. I mean, it creates exactly the kind of jobs we want. It's cool. It gives us street cred. It's just all the things that we like. It attracts the right kind of people to our town, and it's a huge growth industry. So this little bit of friction, going in and having a sublease out of space, having to terminate space, defaulting on leases, it's costing your whole industry money, and it's dragging the growth of the local independent game development. Thanks.